6 months ago, I started an experiment looking at alternatives to moss, and today we're looking at the results. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I've been using moss poles for over 3 years now, and I talk about moss poles in pretty much every single YouTube video. It's no secret that I'm a huge fan of moss poles and the way that they enable me to grow my plants in the way that I want them to grow. Over the last 3 years, I have been getting a lot of questions in relation to alternatives that could be used in your supports because moss has a few disadvantages. First of all, moss can be quite expensive and you might not really be able to get your hands on it at all, or you might not be able to get your hands on a quality moss. Moss isn't always sustainably harvested. I make sure that the moss that I purchase is sustainably harvested, meaning that it's actually renewable. But not all suppliers might be following sustainable practices. So there is an environmental impact in using a lot of moss as well, specifically if you can't get your hands on sustainably harvested or farmed moss. So I thought it might be a good idea to look at some alternatives that are more readily available. Technically, you should be able to fill your pole with pretty much anything. Moss is just a growing medium, so you should be able to fill your pole with any other growing medium and achieve the same or very similar results. But I like to speak from experience, so I wanted to actually set it up and experience it for myself before I go out there and talk to you about any alternatives that I can recommend. Now, this is actually the second time I'm doing this experiment. I did a similar experiment about a year ago. So by now, I feel like I have made enough experiences to talk to you about it. So let's have a look at when I set up the experiment 6 months ago. I will pot up this Epipremnum pinnatum variegata on a moss pole, and then I'll pot it up on a pole filled with cocoa chips. And I'll let them grow up the pole, and I'll see which one works better. Now, I've taken these cuttings from my mother plant over here, and they've been rooting in water for quite a long time. So these are all ready to be potted up. Beautiful. They all have small little shoots already, so they're perfect for a moss pole. Let me just quickly see how many I have. I've chosen just 4 cuttings over here. They all seem to be similar size, similar root system. All 4 of them have a new shoot, and these shoots already started having their own little aerial roots. So you can see over here, that's perfect. They're just dying to grow into a pole. So I'll pot these 2 up on a moss pole, and I'll pot these 2 up on a pole that I will then fill with cocoa chips. So let's start off with the moss pole. My normal procedure: I take the cuttings, I just pin them to the moss pole using a little piece of wire. Right, let me show you this a little bit closer. So you can see these aerial roots now make contact with the moss, and they will grow straight into that moss. Happy days. So I'll just pop this into a pot, and I'll fill it up with Aroid mix. Number 1 is done. Now with the second one, I'll do the exact same. I will just fill this with cocoa chips later on. Beautiful. All right, so I've got the 2 poles here. They're all potted up. Now I just want to fill this with cocoa chips. So what are cocoa chips? Cocoa chips, or also called cocoa chunks, are coconut. It's the same product as cocoa husk or cocoa peat. It's just processed differently. So they're kept in larger chunks, and these chunks are really good at absorbing water and nutrients. So if I squeeze it, you can see that there's quite a lot of water just coming out of this cocoa chip over here, which means that it should have enough water retaining capacity to serve well for my roots that I want to grow into that pole. So let's just fill it up, and I get, oh, what a mess. Alrighty, so I will now give both of them a watering, and I'll do my best to keep both of the poles moist at all times. So that the roots can grow into them. I will also give them the same conditions where possible. So I put them right next to each other so that we can eliminate any other differences that might actually impact our little experiment over here. Now keep in mind, of course, this is not a super trustworthy experiment. They're not going to be perfect conditions for these plants, and obviously also just comparing two plants is not really a good enough sample size to make a call. But I just really want to try it out for myself. Trial and error is the number one thing that I did to actually learn a lot about plants. So I want to keep experimenting and find out if there's something else I could be doing that I don't do already. So you'll probably see me again in a couple of months' time with an update. See ya. Alrighty, and 6 months later, these two plants look like this. I kept them right next to each other, so they had the same light exposure. I watered them in the same frequency with the same water, the same amount of fertilizer. They had the same temperature, same humidity, and so on. So I know it's never going to be a 100% reliable experiment because my sample size is just way too small, but I tried my best to eliminate any other parameter that could impact the growth of these plants so that we can really assess the growth purely based on the medium within the moss pole. Now, I mentioned that this is the second time that I've been doing this experiment. 1 year ago, I did the same experiment with Philodendron verrucosum, and I compared a moss pole with a pole that had Aroid mix in it. Cocoa chunks are part of my Aroid mix, but in my Aroid mix, I also have some bark, pumice, and perlite. So I only use the chunky parts of my Aroid mix because obviously all of the smaller particles would just fall through the mesh. So there's no point in bothering. And with both experiments, I had very similar results. So let's have a look and assess the results. All right, pretty obvious. These plants on the moss pole have grown more than the plants on the cocoa chips. So moss seems to be the winner if we're purely looking at volume of leaves and speed in which it grows or speed in which it climbs the moss pole. And I've had the exact same results last year when I compared the Aroid mix in the moss pole with my Philodendron verrucosum. The moss pole definitely enabled the plant to grow the fastest. Now, that could be because I have had the most experience with moss poles. So my watering schedule, my fertilizer schedule has been pretty much tuned into plants growing on moss poles. And I just happen to take the same approach and apply to the cocoa chips pole. So maybe if I would have more experience with cocoa chips over time, I would be able to optimize my care based on the different medium. And then maybe the cocoa chip pole would have the same potential. I honestly don't know, but I can just speak from my own experiences. For my environment and my care routine, moss seems to be the winner when it comes to speed and quantity of leaves. Now, while the moss pole is the actual winner, the cocoa chips pole is definitely a very, very good alternative. Let's have a little closer look at the cocoa chips pole. The whole idea behind having a medium in your vertical support is that with every node that climbs up the support, the node can send roots into the support, and instead of them just being anchoring roots, fixing the plant to the support, these roots actually turn into water roots, being able to absorb any water and nutrients that I feed the moss pole. Every week I use 5 milliliters of GT Australia Foliage Focus. I put it in a liter of water and I pour it down the moss pole, the support. It's not a moss pole if there's no moss in it. So I pour it down the pole. I make sure that the growing medium in the pole itself has water and nutrients available for these roots to actually grow. Roots seek moisture, so if I don't keep the medium moist, these roots will not turn into water roots. It was definitely a success. I put some close-ups up on screen. You can see that every single node has really taken to the pole and grown roots into these cocoa chunks, and the plastic backing of the moss pole then channeled these roots back into the pot and actually out of the pot as well. So I've got both of them in one of these planters that has a little base, so the nursery pot doesn't touch the bottom of the planter, so there's a bit of a gap. So when I water it, any excess water is just going to accumulate in the bottom. I don't have to worry about overwatering because the medium doesn't actually touch the water, but the roots seek moisture. So the roots are actually channeled from the from the pole into the growing medium and then back into the planter. So I'm kind of doing hydroponics over here. That is the case for the moss pole as well, by the way. So there's no difference in that. So really, there isn't really any difference to the growing experience. I would say the only difference I have noticed is really the speed. So moss pole seems to be increasing the growth rate of these plants. Of course, it could also just be that these two cuttings were more viable than these two, and it just happened to be, a random result. But given my experiences with the last time I ran a very similar result, I do believe that moss is probably the medium that enables me, at least, to grow these plants the fastest. Okay, another disadvantage I see with using cocoa chips instead of moss is that I feel like it's a little messier. When I water this, water is kind of just dripping out everywhere, making a bit of a mess. Whereas with moss, specifically, if the moss is already moist, I can just water that and the moss has a very, very large water retention capacity. So the moss can just absorb that water straight away. Dry moss is hydrophobic, so that doesn't work if your moss is fully dry. But I try to always water my moss poles before they fully dry out, so I'm having a really clean and easy watering experience. I feel like I haven't had the same experience with cocoa chips, even if they're still moist when I water them, just because of all of the gaps between the chips, there is just always a little bit of water splashing out. So if you're after cleanliness of your watering, then probably cocoa chips will make a little bit more mess. But if you may be growing in a greenhouse or you're growing somewhere where you don't really have to worry about the mess, then that's probably not really an issue at all. On the flip side though, because there are more little air pockets in here, this pole actually offers better aeration. So I could see how this could be beneficial to the roots. One other thing that I think we should be considering with any growing medium applies to moss as well as cocoa chips as well as the Aroid mix. We obviously always need to make sure that a medium doesn't just become too acidic, for example, or maybe extract a particular nutrient from your fertilizer so the plant doesn't have that available. I'm not the first person to ever try a different medium in a moss pole. I know a lot of people that have tried various different mediums with great success. Tim from Go Vertical, so the person that actually produces these poles, he has been trying a lot of different mediums in these poles. He's tried cocoa chips, he's tried bark, and one thing that he mentioned to me to be careful with is that over time, cocoa chips can absorb a lot of the calcium that would be in the water or in the fertilizer, meaning that the plant doesn't get to use that calcium. But if you're fertilizing on a regular basis, like I do with every water or like with weekly watering, then that shouldn't be a problem. You shouldn't have to worry about nutrient deficiencies if you're consistently providing your plants with nutrients. Of course, a nutrient deficiency wouldn't necessarily show just after 6 months, so I can't really speak from my own experiences. I have grown plants on moss poles for 3 years, so I can confidently tell you that you don't have to worry about a nutrient deficiency with moss poles if you provide liquid nutrients to your moss pole on a regular basis. I can't speak for any of the other mediums for that matter. So my conclusion is that my personal preferred medium for poles is moss. However, I have access to quality sphagnum moss that's sustainably harvested, so I'm feeling okay with that decision to use moss. If you can't source quality moss, so potentially your moss might come with some pests or some fungal issues already, then maybe moss isn't a really good option. If you can't get your hands on moss, then you can totally use other growing mediums in moss poles. If you're trying an experiment, I would always recommend just try it with one plant at a time. Don't convert your entire collection to a new medium that you haven't made any experiences with. Maybe 6 to 12 months later, you regret that decision. So maybe start with 1 or 2 poles first, maybe try a few different mediums, and then see what works best for you and your plants in your environment with your care routine. If you're looking at making any poles that are not made from moss, I highly recommend you get your hands on an enclosed moss pole. You know, I normally love using the normal round moss poles that are just made out of mesh, which just increases the surface area. And essentially, if I would put cocoa chunks in there or Aroid mix, there would just be a whole lot of bits just falling out through the gaps. Moss stays nice and compact within that moss pole, and also moss makes sure that when I water it, the water is slowly absorbed by the moss and it's kind of mess-free. Whereas with a pole that's filled with Aroid mix or cocoa chunks or bark, there's so many gaps in between that the water would really just be rushing through it and might be splashing everywhere. So I wouldn't recommend doing that in an open pole. I would definitely recommend having an enclosed pole so you can kind of just tilt the pole backwards and then water, so to eliminate the splashback as much as you can. These enclosed poles are from Grow Vertical. Grow Vertical is a local company over here in Sydney, but they do ship internationally. I have a discount code Sydney Plant Guy that gives you 10% off any of these supports. But it's definitely something you could also DIY at home. It's really just a plastic backing and a mesh at the front. I do, however, really like these green bluish ones because they're also made from recycled plastic. So win-win. Anyway, I ended over here. I hope this inspires you to maybe try some different mediums in your poles. And if you're one of the ones that couldn't get your hands on moss, hopefully this gives you an idea of what alternatives you could be using instead. I will link my moss pole playlist over here for you. Any of my tips and tricks that apply to moss poles should really also apply to any other pole filled with any other medium. And I will also link a video over here where I compare different types of supports because that might also be helpful for you to have a look at. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you next time around. Bye.